Thank you for the songs this morning. We'll be going to Genesis chapter 30. We are continuing our series through Genesis. This is message number 31, entitled Gaming the System. We'll be looking at Genesis chapter number 30. And to begin, I'll read verses 1 and 2. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? So chapter 9 followed Jacob outside of the promised land to the land of Haran, which was the land of Abraham's kindred. And Jacob left the land of his fathers. He left the land promised him and his descendants, and he did so out of fear for his life. His tendency to scheme and deal unethically had raised the anger of Esau to the point that he had planned to kill Jacob after his father Isaac died. Now, Jacob's flight then did not start out real well, as he left essentially with nothing. But then God appeared to him and confirmed his covenant with him. And God promised to be with Jacob. Wherever you are, wherever you go, I'm going to be with you. And he also promised that he would bring him back to that land that had been promised to him and to his seed after him. Now, when Jacob arrived in Haran, it seemed like everything was going well. Things are just falling into place. He gets to the well outside the city. He meets Rachel pretty quickly. He's taken to his uncle Laban's house to meet him and the family. And Laban was well enough off that he was able to provide work for Jacob. And so Jacob ends up making arrangements with Laban to work off the bride price, which would take 7 years of labor as he offered to marry Laban's daughter Rachel. And Jacob spent that time joyfully. He said that it seemed just a few days to him, and he completed those terms, and he's ready for the wedding. So all of these things seem to be working out very well for Jacob until Laban at the last minute substitutes Leah for her younger sister Rachel and tricked Jacob into marrying Leah. Now, Jacob was able to make a deal with Laban, and he was going to work for 7 more years, and he would be able to marry Rachel. But from that point, Jacob just once again is plunged back into conflict that seems to threaten the covenant promises in a number of ways. So now as we come into chapter 30 is continuing this account that started at the end of chapter 29 with the growth of Jacob's family. And there's so much rivalry between Rachel and Leah. And we noted even how when the two are introduced in chapter 29, they're introduced in comparison terms to each other. One's older and one's younger and one's more attractive and one's less and so on. Well, Rachel and Leah resort to the use of their maidservants as surrogates in sort of this race to have children. And this part of the account actually ends with Rachel finally having a son herself that she named Joseph. And so with a substantial family now, Jacob's thoughts return to home and returning to the land of his inheritance. But of course, Laban doesn't want to part with Jacob, especially since Jacob's work has been very prosperous for Laban. Well, Jacob once again makes a deal, and Laban thinks that this deal is going to be greatly to his advantage, and that's how how the account goes in chapter number 30. So there's really 2 parts in this chapter. The first part of this chapter is verses 1 to 24, where Rachel and Leah play this game of maids, and in 25 to 43, where Laban and Jacob play this game of goats. So we want to look at this chapter in these 2 parts here this morning, starting with the first part with Rachel and Leah and the game that they are playing. So let's begin with verses 1 to 8. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, Behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah her handmaid to wife, and Jacob went in unto her. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. So we see how, as this chapter starts in these first 8 verses, that Rachel sort of gains the advantage in a manner of speaking against her sister. And we saw it there in the very last verse. She's wrestled with her sister and prevailed. So there's this ongoing struggle and conflict and rivalry between Rachel and Leah. That has obviously taken over really pretty much every aspect of their lives. And these opening verses here of this chapter just capture that dynamic between them. It says Rachel envied her sister. They were jealous of each other. Leah was jealous of the affection that Jacob showed to Rachel. Rachel was jealous of the children that Leah had born to Jacob. And from the account, it seems like that Jacob spent most of the time with Rachel, and she seemed to have some sort of right of first refusal in their family dynamic there. But of course, Leah was the one that at this point had born sons to Jacob. In fact, 4 of them by the time that you get to the end of chapter 29 and start here in chapter number 30. So the verse here points to the continuing conflict in Jacob's family and actually even foreshadows the coming death of Rachel. Rachel said, give me children or else I die. And of course, it will be a little while later, she will actually die giving birth to a son that they named Benjamin. So Jacob acknowledged in his response, it says his anger was kindled, and he says, am I in God's stead who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? Jacob is acknowledging here that God gives children, and he couldn't do anything to change that. And Moses, of course, in this account has given us comment that God had opened the womb of Leah, and then he's closed the womb of Leah. He had closed the womb of Rachel and had not yet been open. And so at this point, neither one of them were having any children. But he acknowledged that God does this, that he can't do anything to change that. And then Rachel resorts to using her female servant as a surrogate. Of course, this reminds us of Sarah's use of Hagar, though in that particular instance, Sarah never owned Ishmael as her son, which Rachel will hear and Leah will later as well. So this account, as you work your way through this chapter, you're going to notice that there's little sprinklings here and there, these little references to God, that his hearing and or his blessing. So we're not given a scene, for instance, like where the servant of Abraham stops and makes this prayer to God for God to bless his the mission that he is on and such. Well, we're not given any scene like that. But we are constantly reminded that God heard and God blessed, God answered Rachel, or God answered Leah. And so obviously there was an ongoing prayer, an ongoing petitioning, an ongoing seeking from God. And that would also explain Jacob's response as well. You know, if we've prayed and God hasn't given an answer, well, what am I to do about it? You know, how can I give you children if God has not done so to this point? So then Rachel gives her handmaid to Jacob, Bilhah, and she bears 2 sons to Jacob. And notice that Rachel names them, which is another indication that she's taking them as her own sons. And we talked about this a bit with Hagar, that it certainly was something practiced in that culture and time for the handmaid of a wife that was barren to have children, you know, through her handmaid. And so when it says, you know, Jacob took her to wife, it wasn't a full legal wife in that sense. And we talked about all of those things before, and that's the situation here. And then we see that after Rachel had gained this advantage, that Leah responds, and in fact Leah once again gains the advantage. So verses 9 to 21. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, A troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she said unto her, Is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. And God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob the fifth son. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again and bare Jacob the sixth son. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him six sons. And she called his name Zebulun. And afterwards she bare a daughter and called her name Dinah. Now, Rachel, having given Jacob her maid to have children by, could not be without some sort of an effect on Leah as well. And so the narrative turns back to her and her response to Rachel's scheme. And so, after having had four sons and then returning to barrenness, Leah also gives her maidservant to Jacob and uses her as a surrogate. And so, Rachel had given her maid to Jacob and had two sons by him or by her. And Leah gives her maidservant to Jacob and has two sons by her as well. And so, as you're keeping track here, the total number of sons of Jacob at this point are eight. The next part of the account has this direct interaction. It starts there in verse 14, has this direct interaction between Rachel and Leah, between these sisters. So Reuben, as you recall, that was Leah's firstborn and Jacob's firstborn son, Reuben. And he had still had to be quite young at this point. We don't have a lot of good time indicators at this point to know exactly where we were and whose age is what, but he had to still be very young at this point. And we're told that he found some mandrakes in the field and brought them to Leah. Now, it's not clear exactly what these mandrakes are. And when you start studying into these kind of things, and you will find different scholars that have researched into such things, and many of them will be very confident that it's this, and some others are very confident that it's something else. And so I've in my attempts to look up and to find out what these were exactly, I realized I just don't believe that we can be sure. There's several options that were presented, but as far as identifying the specific plant, obviously that's not really the point, because regardless of what this was exactly, we can see just from the account, it's obvious that it was something that was valued for the properties that it had, something that would be useful as a stimulant, something that would be possibly had medicinal use to aid in fertility in some way. And so even of the different plants that I saw offered as possibilities for what this was, all of those were those that could be shown to be thought to be valuable for those properties and such. And so that's obviously the point of the account, regardless again of what the specific plant was that's being referred to. But it was something that was found. It was something that was prized. It was something that was valuable. And so then Rachel, in some way, has found out about this, and she goes to Leah to barter with her for these mandrakes. And so Rachel ends up getting the mandrakes, and Leah ends up getting Jacob, so to speak. So Moses gives us sort of an ironic reversal at this point in the game that's being played, because Leah loses the mandrakes. Now remember, at this point, Leah had given her maidservant to Jacob because she wasn't having any more children. And so she gains these mandrakes, no doubt hoping to use them herself and possibly help her to have more children. But she loses the mandrakes, but she lost the mandrakes, but she actually regained her fertility, because she goes on to bear two more sons and a daughter to Jacob after this. So she gives the mandrakes to Rachel, she gains Jacob, and goes on to have these other children. Rachel, on the other hand, she gains the mandrakes that she was seeking because remember, to this point, all of this time, Rachel has continued barren. She has not had any children to this point. And so she sees this as an opportunity to help her cause. And so she gains the mandrakes, but she doesn't gain fertility. And she loses Jacob in a manner of speaking. That ultimately, because it will still be some time before Rachel actually will have a son. But then we do get to that, and that's where we are in verses 22 to 24. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So now we get this word in verse 22 that God remembered Rachel. And that word has been used a few times in Genesis so far. God remembered Noah in Genesis chapter 8 and verse number 1. He remembered his covenant with Noah and with all living things of his creation in Genesis chapter 9, verses 16 to 9, or verses 16 to 19, I think it is, or 15 and 16. And then he remembered Abraham in Genesis chapter 19 and verse number 29. Now that's in reference to Abraham's intercession for Lot and for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And that statement is made that in the sending out of Lot. He didn't destroy the cities and destroy Lot, but he sent Lot away from the cities because he remembered Abraham. So whenever we've seen this word used to this point in Genesis, it has indicated a couple of things. One of those is it's an indication of grace, that that God has made a remembrance and in some way has acted in grace toward those that he has remembered. It's not that they've earned it, it's not that they've achieved it. Oh, okay, well they've done well to this point, so now they've sort of unlocked the next level of living in faith. No, it's an act of grace toward them. The other thing that is emphasized by this is that it's a faithfulness on God's part. So when it says that God remembered, it's saying that God remembered his promises and that he's not going to let those fail. Of course, the point is not that God was in any danger of forgetting about his promises. That's impossible. But what the language means is that he's acting on behalf of that. It's because he has given his word. He has made those promises. He is acting in some way to fulfill it. So here, I believe that the point that's being made here is very similar, that God remembered Rachel. Rachel had prayed and had asked for sons, and God had a purpose for his covenant in Rachel having sons. And so God remembered Rachel in an act of grace, in an act of faithfulness on God's part. He blesses her that she has a son that is named Joseph. So after Jacob had 10 sons and a daughter by Leah and the two handmaids, Rachel finally has a son, and he is named Joseph. And then she concludes there in verse 24, looking forward to God giving her another son. So then we go to the second part, and we really change gears in this chapter, because at this point, now that Jacob has got to this point and Rachel has finally had a son, which seems also in some way signaled the time that is referred to here, Jacob then begins to bargain with Laban, and they begin to play a game of sorts as well. So let's start here with verses 25 to 33. And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said unto Laban, send me away that I may go unto mine own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. And he said, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. And he said unto him, thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. For it was little which thou hadst before I came, and it is now increased unto a multitude. And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now when shall I provide for mine own house also? And he said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything, If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. So Jacob at this point makes Laban an offer. This second part of this chapter focuses on Jacob and Laban as Jacob's thoughts turn toward returning to the land of Canaan. Now, again, we just don't have a good time marker at this point, but it certainly is past the 7 years of additional work that he gave Laban in service for Rachel. So he's had 11 sons. He's had a daughter that has been born. So his family has increased significantly to this point. He has worked for 14 years in order to pay the, the price for his two wives, the two daughters of Laban. And it seemed that all he had received beyond that was room and board, so to speak. In other words, Jacob has not been paid any sort of a wage. He's not participated in any sort of profit sharing program. He has simply tended the flocks and herds of Laban, and he has paid his bride price through rendering his service, and has somehow, had his room and board, so to speak. But beyond that, he hasn't had anything. He doesn't own any possessions. He doesn't have anything. So he's no property, no income to support his family if he sets out for home. And so he requests to leave Laban to be sent out. And of course, Laban is in no hurry to see him go, because he has realized that he is very profitable free labor for the most part. That the profit that he has gained from having Jacob working for him far exceeds any expense that he has laid out in having him work for him. So Laban knew that he was prosperous. Not only that he had prospered, Laban knew that he was unusually prosperous, that there was something more going on here. In fact, he says, the translation here says learned by experience. But the word that is translating is actually a word that means divination. It means the use of divination, the use of enchantment. So Laban, in some way, Laban is a pagan idolater. And in some way, he has learned through divination that it's actually the God of Jacob that is blessing him for having Jacob with him, or he's being blessed through Jacob. And so he's a pagan idolater, but he also knows a good deal when he sees it. And he knows that having Jacob tending his flocks and herds has meant great prosperity and great abundance for him. Now, of course, this echoes back to God's promises beginning with Abraham, that he's going to bless those that bless him. And so we see this promise being fulfilled even in a very specific, tangible way, that Laban, in his blessing of Jacob, so to speak, he is being blessed and probably coming out quite on the good end of that deal. So Laban had enjoyed a great material prosperity because of God's promises beginning all the way back with Abraham. Now, Jacob is careful here as he makes this offer to Laban. And Laban, of course, tells him, you name your wages. And Jacob is very careful. He doesn't want Laban to give him anything. He proposes a plan to Laban where he would be able to keep shepherding the flocks and herds of Laban, but he would make a small percentage as his own profit. And so we get into this discussion of the spotted and the speckled and all of this, and what's all this about? Well, the sheep and the goats. Sheep were mostly white. Goats were mostly black or dark brown. In other words, the livestock of that time, as I understand it, were generally solid colored. They tended to be mostly of a particular solid color. And what Jacob is proposing is to separate out all the flocks and herds, all of the multicolored animals, spotted or streaked or whatever that the case may be. He's going to separate those, which by the understanding would have been a very small part of the flocks and herds anyway. He's going to separate out all of those, and he's going to keep them separate from the regular herds. He's going to sort of divide them into two pieces. And every one that is born of all of these multicolored ones that he has separated out, those would become Jacob's. That would be his payment. If they are born multicolored, then that's going to be his payment. If they are of the standard color that which the majority of the flocks and herds were, then they would be continue to be Laban's. So these multicolored animals in that day and time were, as I understand it, were a bit rare, and they could have only amounted to a very small percentage of the total number of animals that Laban had. So the point is that Jacob carefully lays this out, and he's doing so. He says that his righteousness is going to be attested. In other words, that Jacob is above board here. He hasn't taken Laban. He's not extorted him or taken advantage of him, exploited him in any way, but rather that he has worked and even has set himself at a disadvantage to begin with. And that's obviously, Laban recognizes that. So the deal that Jacob lays out is actually already weighted toward Laban, because he's dealing with already a much smaller and a much more rare occurrence. All right, so then we see Laban's response here in verses 34 to 36. And Laban said, Behold, I would it might be according to thy word. And he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-straked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So as we come to these verses, Jacob ends his offer, and then we start with Laban, his response to it. So already the offer that Jacob has made is one that favors Laban. And he seeks here to even gain further advantage, because rather than doing what Jacob offered, that Jacob would set apart all of the multicolored animals into a separate herd and would gain their offspring. Rather than doing that, Laban takes all of the multicolored animals and gives them to his sons and sends his sons 3 days away from Jacob. So he's removing all of those multicolored animals and putting enough distance between them that he would prevent any mingling of the flocks and herds. And that would make the reality of Jacob getting payment even less than what it was to begin with. So again, Laban is making sure, even though the whole arrangement was already sort of tilted in his advantage, he's making sure to even tilt that even further so that Jacob has less and less to work with, and is going to have to rely just on the recessive genes to throw those multicolored animals. Then we come to verses 37 to 43, the end of this chapter. And Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of the hazel and chestnut tree, and peeled white strakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had peeled before the flocks in the gutters and the watering troughs when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring-straked, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not unto Laban's cattle. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and men servants, and camels, and asses. So Jacob then begins to execute his plan that he had offered to Laban. And he begins using these different rods that are described to attempt to influence the collars of the lambs and the kids and the calves and the what have you of the animals that were born. Now, here again, this is another practice that is debated among different scholars that research these sort of things. Among some, they thought that it's pure superstition that was at work here. Among some, they have thought that perhaps the idea was that there was some sort of properties, and by peeling back the bark on these rods and putting them in the watering troughs of the animals, that somehow they're drinking something that would in some way contribute to this. And so there's a few different ideas about this, what it was, and why Jacob was doing it, and all of that sort of thing. Um, it does seem to be at least a somewhat superstitious practice, perhaps along the line of what we might consider an old wives' tale today. But in the next chapter, Jacob does make clear that his prosperity came from God, that his prosperity didn't come from his scheme, but it came from God. Though he does seem to be trying in some way to tilt things in his favor. And of course, it certainly did work out that way. So Laban has also experienced this ironic reversal. So the deal starts out that's already in his favor. Then he seeks to enhance his own odds and to reduce Jacob's. However, despite that, Jacob thrived and he flourished and he prospered in his payment from the flocks and herds, and they brought forth multicolored animals in abundance, which again is was a very unusual situation in that time. So this account ends in verse 43 with this authorial comment. And the man increased exceedingly and had much cattle and maidservants and men servants and camels and asses. His household had increased. His servants had increased. His own livestock had increased greatly, to the point where he has become very well off. He has profited greatly through the work that he has put in, and ultimately from the blessing of God. So by every measure that we could take, Jacob has increased. He has prospered materially. And the point, of course, is being that's being drawn attention to is the fact that this comes from God's promise. God's promise to be with him and to bless him that was given him before he even stepped foot in the land of Haran. So as we look at chapter number 30, there are at least a couple of ways of misreading this chapter for practical applications, and there's probably many, many more ways. But there seemed to be two that were most obvious to me in thinking through this chapter. And one of those ways would be the idea that if we can discern what God is doing, that we can game the system to maximize the benefits to us. In other words, what we see here is that God had promised to Jacob that he was going to bless him. He's going to bless him greatly. He's going to multiply him greatly. He's going to be with him. He's going to bring him back to the land so that Jacob knows that he's under the protection. His children were, as described, going to be as the dust of the ground. So he has these sort of promises. And so if again, we can discern that God is working in a certain way or toward a certain end, then that means that any means that we employ to achieve that result then would be acceptable. And the result being achieved would validate it. Well, another way of putting that is the pragmatic view that the ends justify the means. And so the outcome is all that matters, not how that we get there. And again, that would be a great misreading of this chapter, because again, woven throughout this chapter is the idea that God has heard and God has acted and God has remembered and God has opened and God has closed and God has blessed. And again, that's going to be punctuated when we get into the next chapter as well. Well, another way that, again, at least to me seemed pretty obvious of misreading this chapter is the idea that one person winning in this account necessitates another person losing. And that seems to be exactly what happens from beginning to end of this chapter. So Rachel starts out and she's losing to Leah, so to speak. And so she comes up with a way and she gains the advantage. And then it turns back to Leah and she regains the advantage. And it seems like for one to win, the other has to lose, so to speak. And then you come to Jacob and Laban in the second part of the chapter. And in order for Jacob to prosper and to increase, well, then Laban would have to lose. And in order for Laban to increase, he's got to make sure that Jacob loses. Well, this is what's called a zero-sum game. And that's in game theory. A zero-sum game is a game where gaining by one necessarily means losing by another. So regardless of what happens in the game, and over the course of the game, as some might be up and some might be down, regardless of what happens in the game, the net change in wealth is zero, hence a zero-sum game. I don't know a lot about the game of poker, but I think it would be a good example from what I do understand, because you've got a number of players that are playing, and they've put in, I don't know if you call that the pot or not, but they've put in to this pot. So this total pot, whatever it is that is available, everyone has contributed a certain amount for it. And in the end, there's one winner. And that one winner, his winnings or her winnings are going to be the sum total of everybody else's losses. That's a zero-sum game. For that person to win, the other people lose. Again, I believe that that's the basics of how that game works. But there are all kinds of games that are that way, zero-sum games, all kinds of ways. So this would be another misreading of this chapter. In other words, it would sort of make us look at the blessings of God as some sort of a competitive endeavor, as if for me to be blessed of God, I have to gain advantage over someone, or I'm jealous of if God has blessed someone else, my neighbor, for instance, and I see some blessing that has come on them, well, I'm jealous of that because in some way I feel like that's taken something away from me. Now, even though that's irrational, we know that we have those sort of thoughts and feelings. We see someone else be blessed, someone else seem to prosper, someone else seem to maybe get a step up, and we feel like something's been taken away from us. Well, it's not a competitive endeavor. It's not a zero-sum game. So what's the real lesson when we come to a chapter like this? Well, God's blessings are not the result of competition. They're not the result of advantage. You're not blessed more by outdoing someone else. God's blessings come through His grace, which means we don't ever deserve them. We don't ever deserve His blessings. We don't ever deserve His good gifts. They come through His grace. They come through His faithfulness to His own promises, not through us finding some loophole, and certainly not through us attempting to step on the neck of our brother or sister and push them down in order to get ourselves up. And so as we look at this, God doesn't just overlook our foolishness and sin, which we see a lot of in the story of Jacob and his life and his family. God doesn't just overlook our foolishness and sin. He overcomes it, again, through His grace and through His faithfulness. So what this means is that God's blessings are not a zero-sum game. Do you understand that the riches of God are inexhaustible? The riches of God are infinite. The riches of God are incomprehensible. Notice just a few verses that speak of the riches in Christ. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 7. In whom, talking about in Christ, we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of His grace. Verse 18 says, the eyes of your understanding being enlightened, that ye may know what is the hope of His calling, and what the riches of the glory of His inheritance in the saints. Ephesians 2:7 says that in the ages to come, He might show the exceeding riches of His grace and His kindness toward us through Christ Jesus. Think about another way that it's put here in Romans chapter number 8, verses 14 to 18. Paul wrote, "For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. For you have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may be also glorified together." And notice this, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." And he goes on in that chapter in verse 32 to say, he's talking about God the Father, who spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? So the blessings of God, again, come from his inexhaustible riches in Jesus Christ. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not about me winning and another having to lose. So these riches are just beyond human comprehension. And in the ages to come, for all of those who believe in Jesus Christ, God is going to bestow these great riches in Jesus Christ. So what does that tell us for this present life? Well, be patient. Be patient. Endure the present sufferings. They are for a brief time in this life. And also understand that this life is not the reward. And this life is not where we are to look for our reward, even though God does bless us as his people. All of us could give testimony to different ways that God has blessed us. And the problem is that all of us have probably forgotten more of God's blessings in our lives than we actually remember. So you don't need to fight and to strain and to strive and try to turn things to your advantage. You don't need to compete with other people for God's blessings. As the Bible says, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And he freely gives of his riches by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And so just as the nation of Israel needed to learn and understand that God acts by his grace, he acts in faithfulness to his word, he has promised to give you this land. What do you need to do? You need to obey and you need to trust him. And of course, that is the same message to us today as well. All right, that's all the message for this morning. We will close with a hymn.